Welcome to today's analysis. Today, we're diving into the complete life story of arguably history's most famous and definitely most debated figure, Jesus Christ. In this explainer, we're going to trace the entire narrative exactly as it's laid out in the historical and biblical texts. We'll follow the journey from his birth all the way to the crucifixion. But, we aren't just stopping at the stories you've probably heard a million times. We're also going to take a completely impartial look at some mind-bending alternative historical theories. Theories that actually try to fill in the massive, honestly perplexing gaps in his biography. So we'll map out what the texts actually say, what they totally leave out, and the fascinating mysteries that are literally still captivating researchers today. Let's get right into it.
Okay, let's dive into this roadmap. First, we'll look at the birth of Jesus Christ, then move into the mysterious years and his baptism. From there, we'll cover his teachings and the growing opposition, the journey to the cross, the resurrection and ascension, and finally, we'll wrap up with those unsolved mysteries and beliefs, including a really shocking theory about his final resting place in India.
Before we jump into the timeline, let's just ground ourselves in the actual historical facts regarding his name. You might be surprised to know that in original Hebrew, he was known as Yeshua or Joshua, and he's actually recognized as a prophet in traditions that predate Christianity. But as these ancient texts were translated, moving through completely different languages and cultures, the pronunciation naturally shifted. Joshua evolved over time, and eventually, in the English pronunciation we're all familiar with today, it became Jesus. It's a really fascinating linguistic journey that kind of perfectly sets the stage for the massive global impact of his life.
All right, let's start at the very beginning. Section 1. The birth of Jesus Christ.
Now, when you actually sit down and look at the primary texts, there are differing accounts regarding his family's earliest movements. The narrative basically splits into two main theories depending on which gospel you read. According to the book of Luke, Jesus' parents, Mary and Joseph, who was a carpenter by trade, lived in the village of Nazareth. They traveled all the way to Bethlehem because Emperor Augustus ordered a massive census, and that is where Mary gave birth. However, the book of Matthew presents a pretty different angle. It states he was born in Bethlehem, but then the family actually had to flee down to Egypt because King Herod ordered the execution of all children under 2 years old. Talk about a dramatic start, right? Then, after Herod's death, they returned and settled back in Nazareth. Now, while historians definitely debate the exact reasons for their travels, both accounts are absolutely firmly in agreement on two things. His parents were from Nazareth, and his birthplace was Bethlehem.
And this brilliantly illustrates the absolute cornerstone of his origin story, which begins with some major divine intervention. According to the texts, Mary was a virgin, betrothed to Joseph. The narrative describes this incredible moment where the angel Gabriel appears to her, delivering the profound message that she was specially chosen by God. This divine intervention is literally the foundation of the Christian belief regarding his conception, and it explains how Joseph ultimately accepted her as his wife after receiving a sign from God, completely setting the stage for the miraculous life that was about to unfold.
But right after establishing his birth and at early childhood, we instantly hit our first major historical wall. The texts note that when Jesus was about 12 years old, he was hanging out in Jerusalem, totally astonishing the Jewish priests with these incredibly profound theological debates. And then, absolutely nothing. Radio silence. His whereabouts become completely unknown in the Bible, which brings us to a massive, glaring question. Where on earth was Jesus between the ages of 13 and 29? And that massive gap in the historical record brings us right to Section 2, the mysterious years and baptism.
Now, what's really interesting here is just the sheer volume of unrecorded time. We have that famous debate at age 12, and then an 18-year total blackout. The general assumption in the traditional texts is simply that he returned to Nazareth, learned the carpentry trade from Joseph, and just lived a quiet, completely ordinary life. The narrative suddenly hits the play button again at age 30, when he's baptized by St. John, and it's only after this baptism that his public ministry actually begins, a public ministry that would only last about 3 short years before his crucifixion at age 33.
Those 3 years completely changed the world, which brings us to Section 3, teachings and growing opposition.
When Jesus began preaching, his message was, frankly, radically different from the religious establishment of the time. He focused heavily on internal morality, deep compassion, and actively helping people, rather than just adhering to the really complex, rigid rituals of the day. But to spread this radical message of the kingdom of heaven, he knew he couldn't do it alone. So he chose 12 specific disciples. He granted them special teachings and the authority to help carry this revolutionary message all across the region. But here's the catch. By claiming to fulfill the spirit of the law, rather than enforce its strict, literal rules, he drew some incredibly intense and dangerous opposition from the Orthodox Jewish leaders. They strictly enforced the old laws and absolutely viewed his growing movement as a severe threat to their traditions and, more importantly, to their authority.
And all of that building tension finally reached its absolute boiling point during what's known as the Temple Incident. Aligning perfectly with Old Testament prophecies from Isaiah, Jesus arrived in Jerusalem riding on a donkey, welcomed by massive crowds waving palm branches. But when he actually entered the temple courtyard, he found it functioning more like a noisy marketplace, just packed with Roman tax collectors and money changers. According to the texts, he was deeply sorrowful and honestly really angry. He literally made a whip and forcefully drove them all out. This aggressive physical cleansing of the temple was the final straw. It completely infuriated the religious leaders and really alarmed the Roman governor Pilate, who was terrified it might spark a massive rebellion.
The intense reaction from the establishment leads us directly into Section 4, the journey to the cross.
Let's move to the next events and see how this builds. Following the Last Supper, where he was betrayed by his own disciple, Judas, and after a rapid late-night trial where the Roman governor Pilate condemned him, the physical ordeal that followed was systematically brutal. First, he was severely beaten or scourged, and the soldiers forced a literal crown of thorns onto his head. Second, he was forced to carry the incredibly heavy wooden cross himself. Third, he walked what is now known as the Path of Sorrows. And finally, he was crucified. Throughout this agonizing, very public execution, the texts specifically note that his mother Mary, her sister, and Mary Magdalene stood close by, forced to watch the entire thing unfold.
The specific location of this event is actually really crucial to history. He was taken to Golgotha, which is known as the Hill of the Calvary in Jerusalem. Today, this entire agonizing route is highly documented in religious tradition. The journey from the site of his public condemnation, which is now known as the Church of the Flagellation, all the way to Golgotha actually encompasses 9 holy sites along the path. These sites mark a permanent, physical, geographical footprint of that dark day right there in the ancient city.
But of course, the narrative doesn't end with his death. Let's shift our focus to Section 5, Resurrection and Ascension.
So, the absolutely crucial point here is what supposedly happened next. After his death, a follower placed his body inside a cave tomb, sealing the entrance with a massive, incredibly heavy stone. But early that Sunday morning, Mary Magdalene visited the tomb and discovered the stone had been rolled away. The tomb was totally empty. The texts claim that Jesus then appeared to her, fully alive, and later appeared to his disciples as well. This miraculous return from the dead is the exact event that is celebrated globally today as Easter. And according to the narrative, he didn't just pop in for a quick visit, he stayed on earth for 40 full days to finalize his teachings and officially establish his church.
At the end of those 40 days, the texts describe his final dramatic departure. He took his apostles up to the Mount of Olives, blessed them, and then literally ascended into the sky, eventually enveloped by a cloud. And immediately after that happened, 2 angels appeared and delivered a really profound promise. They said that this Jesus, who was taken into heaven, would one day return in the exact same manner to judge all of humanity.
Which perfectly brings us to our final and maybe most intriguing part of the analysis, Section 6, Unsolved Mysteries and Beliefs. Let's just take a step back and distill exactly what the Bible actually gives us. If you zoom out, the biblical texts primarily provide just 7 specific snapshots of his entire life. We have his birth, a super brief mention of a temple visit at age 7, his baptism at 30, his teachings with the disciples, the Last Supper, his crucifixion, and finally his resurrection. That's essentially the whole shebang, just 7 very specific windows into a life that literally changed the entire course of human history.
Which, of course, leaves us with the ultimate unknowns. I mean, think about it. An entire human lifespan outside of those 7 isolated snapshots is completely unrecorded. What actually happened during those deeply formative years from age 13 all the way to 29? Did he really just stay out of sight in Nazareth doing carpentry for nearly 2 decades? And furthermore, what happened after age 33? The texts say he ascended to heaven and was simply never seen again. But these massive, glaring historical voids have really paved the way for modern researchers to seek alternative, sometimes radical explanations way outside the traditional dogma.
And that brings us to one of the absolute most fascinating alternative historical theories that try to fill in these wild timelines, the Kashmir theory.
Because those years between 13 and 29 are completely unaccounted for, and because his physical body disappeared after age 33, some researchers claim that Jesus actually traveled east. This theory proposes that he went all the way to India. Some say he survived the crucifixion, or bypassed it entirely, continued his teachings, lived to be about 100 years old, and ultimately died over there. In fact, there's a shrine today called Razabal in Srinagar, Kashmir, where proponents of this theory boldly claim he is actually buried. It's a really striking attempt by historians and researchers to piece together those massive missing chapters of his biography.
All of which leaves us with a final, really provocative thought to ponder. We've traced the canonical texts all the way from Bethlehem to Golgotha, and we've explored the massive historical gaps that lead all the way over to Kashmir. But looking at it all, it really forces us to ask, was the full, unabridged story of history's most famous figures simply lost to the ravages of time? Or are the missing pieces of this ancient puzzle still waiting out there, just waiting to be fully discovered? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep asking those big questions, and I'll see you next time.